There is a room deep inside a military training facility that has no windows. The door locks from the outside, the walls are concrete, and the soldiers placed inside it have one mission: get out. Not by force, not by luck, but by skill, by training, by the knowledge they have spent months drilling into their hands and their minds until it becomes automatic. Because one day, that room might not be a training cell. One day, those handcuffs might not be rubber. One day, the cage might be real, and the enemy standing outside the door will not be an instructor with a clipboard. This is the world of prisoner of war resistance training. And what happens inside it will absolutely change the way you think about what soldiers are capable of. If you have respect for the men and women who train to serve and survive for this country, type warrior in the comments right now. Before we go any further, please take a second to subscribe and hit the like button. Over 98% of people who watch never subscribe. It costs you nothing and it means everything. Now let us get into it. Most people have a general idea that military training is hard. They picture push-ups at dawn, long runs through mud, shouting drill sergeants. And yes, all of that is real. But there is an entire layer of military preparation that most civilians never hear about, never see, and honestly, most people would struggle to believe exists in the way that it does. It sits underneath the combat skills, underneath the weapons training, underneath the physical conditioning. It lives in a place that militaries around the world guard very carefully, not because it is shameful, but because if your enemies understand the full scope of what your soldiers are trained to do, they start building better cages. We are talking about escape and evasion training. We are talking about resistance to captivity. We are talking about the specific, technical, deeply rehearsed skills that allow a captured soldier to slip out of restraints, to compromise a lock, to find a weakness in a cell, to escape, evade, and survive long enough to come home. This is not a movie. This is not a spy thriller. This is the documented, verified reality of programs that exist inside the United States military, inside special operations units across NATO, inside elite forces from Australia to Israel to the United Kingdom. And the techniques they teach, the psychology behind them, and the stories of the soldiers who have survived captivity because of them, form one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of military training. Let us start from the very beginning. Why does this training exist at all? The answer sounds obvious, but it goes much deeper than you might expect. For as long as there have been wars, there have been prisoners. Ancient armies took captives. Medieval knights were ransomed. World War I soldiers rotted in camps on both sides of the trenches. World War II produced some of the most famous escape stories in human history. The Great Escape, the Wooden Horse, Colditz Castle, men digging tunnels with spoons, hiding dirt in their trouser legs, forging identity papers with brushes made from their own hair. Those stories are not just adventure tales. They are proof that the human will to escape, when combined with skill and preparation, can overcome almost anything. But after World War II, after Korea, after Vietnam, the military began to look at captivity not just as a misfortune of war, but as a predictable operational risk that could be systematically prepared for. Soldiers were going to be captured. Pilots were going to be shot down. Special operations teams were going to be compromised behind enemy lines. The question was not whether this would happen. The question was, what kind of training could a soldier receive before deployment that might give them a fighting chance not just to survive captivity, but to escape it, evade their captors, and resist the kind of psychological pressure that can break even extraordinarily tough men and women? The answer to that question became a program. In the United States military, that program is called SERE. It stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. And it is without question one of the most psychologically and physically demanding training programs that exists anywhere in the American military structure. It is not optional for certain categories of service members: pilots, aircrew, special operations personnel, certain intelligence officers, certain naval officers, and others who face an elevated risk of capture must complete SERE training before they can be considered fully mission qualified. That is how seriously the military takes this subject. It is not a nice-to-have, it is a must-have. SERE training is conducted at several locations across the United States. The primary facility for the military's highest-level SERE course, known as SERE Level C, is located at a remote installation in the mountains of Maine called the Maine Survival Training Area, operated out of Brunswick. There is also a major SERE school at Fort Liberty in North Carolina, serving Army Special Operations, and the Navy and Marine Corps run their own SERE training at Naval Air Station North Island in California. The Air Force SERE program is headquartered out of Fairchild Air Force Base in Washington State. Each branch tailors certain elements of the training to its own operational environment, but the core structure, the core skills, the core psychology, those are consistent, and that core includes escape. Now let us talk about what actually happens in that training. Because the escape phase is not what most people imagine. It is not soldiers being handed a hidden key and told to pick a lock. It is a full-spectrum education in the mechanics of restraint, the vulnerabilities of captivity, and the specific physical techniques that can create an opportunity when one seems impossible. Let us walk through each element in detail. We start with handcuffs, because handcuffs are the most common restraint a captured soldier is likely to encounter. They are used by military forces. They are used by police and paramilitary organizations. They are used by insurgent groups and militias around the world. They are simple, they are cheap, and in the hands of someone who does not know how to defeat them, they are highly effective. In the hands of someone who has been through proper training, they are something else entirely. The first thing SERE instructors teach about handcuffs is this. A handcuff is a mechanical device, and every mechanical device has vulnerabilities. The standard double-lock handcuff, the kind used by law enforcement and militaries worldwide, operates on a ratchet and pawl system. The ratchet is the tooth bar that slides into the housing and clicks down into the lock. The pawl is the small catch that holds the ratchet in place. When you apply a standard handcuff key, you are doing one of two things. You are either releasing the pawl directly, which is the primary unlock function, or you are engaging the double lock mechanism, which sets a secondary pin that prevents the ratchet from moving further. This prevents the handcuff from being tightened after locking, which would cut off circulation and cause injury. It also, and this is critical, adds an extra step to any escape attempt. Trained soldiers learn the internal mechanics of the most common handcuff models in detail. They learn where the keyhole is, what angle the key must enter at, and crucially, what other objects can substitute for a key. A standard handcuff key is remarkably simple in design. It is essentially a small tubular key with a post that interfaces with the lock mechanism. The ubiquity and simplicity of this design means that a wide range of everyday objects can be modified to function as a key with proper instruction. Bobby pins, hair clips, certain paper clips shaped to the correct profile, the stiff wire used to seal plastic bags, the tension bar from a ballpoint pen cap, the metal tab from a watch band. The possibilities are extensive. The technique is not. It requires practice, precision, and the ability to perform the task under stress with limited visibility, sometimes in complete darkness, sometimes with hands behind the back, sometimes with fingers that have been partially numbed from cold or from the handcuff being applied too tightly. This is why the training does not just teach the technique once, it drills it repeatedly. Soldiers practice the skill in ideal conditions first, seated, good light, hands in front. Then they practice in degraded conditions. Then in darkness. Then with time pressure. Then behind the back. Then while being monitored or observed by someone simulating a guard. The muscle memory that develops through this repetition is what makes the difference in an actual captivity scenario. When adrenaline is running and fear is present, fine motor skills degrade. Training compensates for that degradation. If you have done something 1,000 times under controlled stress, you can do it under real stress. That is the entire premise. Beyond the key mechanism, soldiers also learn about the structural vulnerabilities of handcuffs themselves. The chain that connects standard handcuffs is typically short, but the connection points and the housing of the cuff itself can sometimes be exploited under the right conditions. There are specific mechanical weaknesses in the ratchet housing of certain cuff designs that can be leveraged with applied pressure in a particular direction. Soldiers learn to assess the specific type of restraint they are dealing with, not to apply a one-size-fits-all technique, but to quickly identify which approach is most likely to produce an opening. They also learn about flex cuffs, zip ties, plastic restraints. Because in modern conflict environments, flex cuffs are extremely common. They are cheap, disposable, easy to carry in bulk, and widely used by irregular forces and insurgent groups. The standard military-issue flex cuff is a nylon loop with a locking head. The escape technique for a flex cuff applied with the hands in front is different from the one used when the hands are behind the back. For hands in front, the classic technique involves building tension in the cuffs by raising the arms and then driving the elbows down sharply to the sides while simultaneously pulling the wrists apart. The goal is to generate enough force to break the locking mechanism or split the nylon itself. This works with varying degrees of reliability, depending on the thickness of the cuff and how tightly it was applied. Thin zip ties, applied with limited tension, are quite vulnerable to this technique. Heavy-duty nylon restraints require more force or a different approach. When flex cuffs are applied behind the back, a different sequence is required. The soldier must first work the cuffed hands from behind the body to in front of the body, a process that requires significant shoulder and hip flexibility. Once the hands are in front, the braking technique can be applied. Siri training includes flexibility conditioning, specifically because this maneuver is part of the survival toolkit. The ability to pass your bound hands from behind your body to the front is a fundamental skill, and it is one that depends entirely on flexibility in the hip flexors and shoulders. Soldiers who cannot perform this maneuver in training are pushed to develop the range of motion necessary. There is also the rope restraint, still used in many parts of the world, particularly in regions where manufactured restraints are less available. Rope presents a different set of challenges and opportunities. The vulnerabilities of rope restraint depend heavily on the material of the rope, the knot type used, and the skill of the person who applied the binding. A captor who knows what they are doing with rope can create a binding that is genuinely difficult to escape. But most captors are not knot specialists. Most captors apply rope restraint quickly, under operational pressure, with imperfect technique. SEER training teaches soldiers to exploit this imperfection. The primary strategy is deception at the moment of restraint. When an enemy is applying a rope restraint, the trained soldier follows a very specific protocol. They tense their muscles, they expand their wrists if the binding is being applied to the wrists, they take a deep breath to expand the chest if the binding is being applied to the torso, they create whatever gap they can between their body and the restraint at the moment of application. Because that gap, measured in millimeters, may be the difference between a binding that can be worked loose over time and one that simply cannot. The soldier does not resist visibly. They comply on the surface, while covertly doing everything possible to compromise the restraint. After the captor leaves, the soldier works the restraint. They use friction against surfaces. They use coordinated muscle contraction and relaxation to create movement in the knot. They use any available sharp edge to work against rope fibers if a cutting approach is viable. And they are patient. The patience required in real captivity escape attempts is enormous. These are not the quick cinematic escapes of a spy film. They are slow, deliberate, sometimes hours-long processes of millimeter-by-millimeter progress. Siri training conditions soldiers for that reality by making them sit with discomfort, making them work problems slowly, teaching them to suppress the panic response that tells a human being to pull harder, move faster, make noise. Because panic wastes energy, alerts guards, and ruins carefully built progress. Now let us talk about the cage, because the cage is the next layer. Once a soldier is placed in a cell, whether that is a physical cage, a locked room, a modified shipping container, an improvised holding facility made from whatever materials were available, the challenge shifts. The restraints may be off. The space may give some freedom of movement, but the question becomes the same: how do you get out? And this is where SEER training moves into something that overlaps with a different field entirely: lockpicking, structural assessment, improvised tool fabrication, and the understanding of how detention facilities, even improvised ones, almost always contain exploitable weaknesses. Let us start with locks, because even in the most primitive captivity scenario, there is almost always a lock somewhere: on a door, on a chain, on a padlock attached to a gate. Locks are everywhere, and every lock is a puzzle, and puzzles have solutions. The most commonly encountered lock type in military captivity scenarios is the standard pin tumbler lock. This is the same kind of lock that operates the front door of virtually every house in America. It works on a simple principle. A series of spring-loaded pin stacks sits inside the lock cylinder. Each pin stack consists of 2 pins, a key pin below and a driver pin above. When no key is inserted, the driver pins cross the shear line between the rotating cylinder and the fixed housing, preventing the cylinder from turning. When the correct key is inserted, it lifts each pin stack to precisely the right height, so that the gap between the key pin and the driver pin aligns with the shear line at every position simultaneously, allowing the cylinder to rotate and the lock to open. Siri training introduces soldiers to the concept of lockpicking, which exploits the mechanical tolerances inherent in every real-world pin tumbler lock. Because a real lock is not a perfect mathematical machine, The hole in which the cylinder sits is not perfectly centered. The pins do not bind against the cylinder wall with equal force at all positions. When rotational tension is applied to the cylinder using a simple tool called a tension wrench, the slight imperfections in the lock cause the pins to bind at slightly different points in the rotation. A pick tool can then be used to lift and set each pin individually at the shear line while tension is maintained. Set all the pins at the shear line while maintaining tension, and the lock opens. This technique, called single pin picking or raking depending on the specific approach used, can be learned to a functional level with surprisingly modest training. This is not a mysterious trade secret. It is a documented, teachable mechanical skill. The tools required are extremely simple. A tension wrench is nothing more than a thin, flat piece of metal, bent at a specific angle. It can be fabricated from the clip of a pen, from a flat piece of metal foil, from a variety of mundane objects. A pick can be made from a bobby pin, a narrow piece of heavy wire, the back of an earring, a needle, a straightened paper clip shaped to a hook at the tip. The materials are everywhere. The skill is the differentiator. Soldiers in SEER training practice picking a variety of lock types under increasingly difficult conditions. They learn to assess whether a given lock is likely to be pickable based on its age, its quality, its level of wear. An older, heavily worn lock is often easier to pick because the tolerances have opened up. A high-security lock with tight tolerances and security pins is much more resistant. Training teaches soldiers not just the technique, but the triage. Is this lock worth spending time on, or is there a better point of effort available? Beyond picking, soldiers learn about shimming padlocks, which involves inserting a thin piece of metal into the shackle channel of a padlock to depress the locking pawl and allow the shackle to retract. They learn about bypass techniques that avoid the lock mechanism entirely, exploiting the gap between the door and the frame, the weakness of the hinges, the limitations of the hasp or the bracket holding the lock. Because in improvised captivity facilities, the lock is often the strongest part of the system. The screws holding the hasp may be loose. The door may fit poorly in its frame. The hinges may be accessible from the inside. A trained soldier assessing a cell is not just looking at the lock. They are looking at the entire structural system. They are asking where is the weakest point. And the weakest point is rarely the lock itself. This is a fundamental concept that runs through all of SEER's escape curriculum. The goal is not to defeat security systems at their strongest point. The goal is to identify and exploit the weakest point. That might be the lock. It might be the door. It might be the wall. It might be the guard schedule. It might be the inattention of a particular person at a particular time of day. The trained soldier is constantly conducting a quiet, invisible assessment of every element of their captivity environment, looking for the seam in the system. Now let us talk about what it actually looks like inside a SEER training facility. Because the simulated captivity phase of SEER training is not just a demonstration. It is a fully immersive experience designed to replicate, to the degree possible within a training context, the psychological and physical realities of actual captivity. And understanding what happens during that simulation helps explain why the training is so effective at building the skills and the mental toughness that soldiers carry with them for the rest of their careers. The simulated captivity phase, often called the resistance laboratory or the POW phase in various SEER programs, typically begins after the survival and evasion portions of the course. Students have already spent days in the field, learning navigation, shelter construction, fire starting, water procurement, signaling, and evading simulated pursuit forces. They are already physically depleted, sleep-deprived, and mentally stressed by the time captivity begins. That is not an accident. The training is designed to introduce captivity-related stressors after the student's physical and psychological reserves have already been depleted, because that more closely mirrors the conditions of actual capture. The capture itself is typically dramatic and disorienting. A simulated enemy force closes in on the students during their field exercise. There is noise, confusion, shouting in a foreign or simulated foreign language. Students are taken down, restrained, hooded, and transported to the facility. The hood is not just for drama. Sensory deprivation, even partial, creates significant disorientation. A student who cannot see, does not know where they are, does not know how many guards are present, does not know the layout of the facility. That vulnerability is the baseline from which the captivity exercise begins. Inside the facility, students are placed in individual cells. These cells are deliberately small. They are built to create physical and psychological pressure. The lighting may be poor or non-existent. The temperature is managed to create discomfort without causing genuine harm. Noise is controlled, sometimes total silence for extended periods, sometimes loud, repetitive sounds. Meals are provided at unpredictable intervals in small quantities. Sleep is disrupted deliberately. All of these elements are calibrated by instructors who understand the psychology of captivity at a deep level, and the entire exercise is monitored by safety officers whose job is to ensure that no student crosses the line from training stress into genuine harm. Within this environment, students must apply everything they have been taught. They must maintain their mental stability under conditions designed to erode it. They must adhere to the code of conduct, the set of principles that governs the behavior of U.S. military personnel in captivity. They must resist efforts by the role-playing interrogators to extract information beyond the name, rank, service number, and date of birth that the Geneva Convention requires. And when the opportunity presents itself, or when they can create an opportunity, they must attempt to escape. The escape attempts in the SARA captivity phase are real. Students are given training in advance. They know the techniques. But the application of those techniques, under the conditions of the resistance laboratory, is a genuinely different challenge than applying them in a classroom. Because in the resistance laboratory, failure to escape means remaining in the cell. It means continuing to experience the psychological pressure. It means the discomfort continues. That is a real motivator. And that real motivation, combined with the real stress of the environment, is what transforms intellectual knowledge of escape techniques into embodied automatic skill. Students pick locks that are real locks with real mechanisms. They work restraints that are genuine restraints applied with real tension. They look for genuine structural weaknesses in cells built with deliberate imperfections. Because SERE instructors understand that the point of the training is not to defeat students. The point is to develop survivors. So the cells have weaknesses. The guards have schedules with gaps. The locks are not hardened high-security systems. They are standard commercial-grade locks that a trained person can defeat. The training is demanding, but it is structured to produce success if the student applies their training correctly, and that success is intentional. It teaches students a visceral truth that no lecture can deliver. Escape is possible. These skills work. The training is real. Now let us move from the American SARE program to look at how other elite military forces around the world approach the same challenge. Because this is not purely an American institution. The principles behind escape and resistance training are universal, but the specific methods, the cultural emphases, and the particular techniques that different militaries prioritize vary in ways that reveal something deeply interesting about how different military cultures think about the nature of individual resilience. The British military operates its own SARE equivalent through the Joint Services Intelligence Organization, the JCO, which trains personnel at the Defence SARE Training Organization in Hereford, among other locations. The British program has a particular historical resonance given the UK's experience with prisoner-of-war situations across both world wars and numerous subsequent conflicts. British SARE has a reputation within the NATO community for being particularly demanding in the psychological resistance component of the training. The interrogation scenarios used in the British program are known for their sophistication and their psychological intensity. British SARE graduates often note that the resistance phase was the most genuinely challenging thing they experienced in their military careers, and this is a population that includes SAS operators and Royal Marines commandos, people who have completed some of the most physically punishing selection processes in the world. The psychological challenge of captivity, they say, exceeds the physical. The Australian Defence Force operates SARE training through the RAF Survival Training Centre and corresponding Army and Navy programs. Australian SARE is notable for its integration of Indigenous Australian survival knowledge with conventional military SARE content. The evasion component of Australian SARE training incorporates bush survival techniques that are deeply specific to the Australian operational environment, an environment that presents its own unique challenges in terms of climate, terrain, and distance. But the captivity and escape components of Australian SARE align closely with the NATO standard, and Australian and US SARE programs maintain a strong exchange relationship, with instructors from both nations participating in cross-training. The Israeli Defense Forces' approach to SARE is shaped by a very specific and deeply traumatic historical reality. The IDF has faced the loss of soldiers and airmen to captivity in every major conflict since the state's founding, and Israeli prisoners have been subjected to conditions far outside the bounds of the Geneva Convention on multiple occasions. The Israeli military has consequently developed a captivity resistance and escape doctrine that is rooted not in theoretical risk, but in documented historical experience. Israeli SARA training has a particular emphasis on psychological resilience and on the concept of the captured soldier as an active combatant even while in captivity. The idea that capture ends the soldier's mission is rejected entirely in the IDF training culture. Capture changes the mission. The mission becomes survival, resistance, and return. This concept, the captured soldier as still operational, still fighting, still pursuing the mission of return, is actually a principle that appears across virtually every serious fire program in the world. It is perhaps the most important mindset shift that SARA training attempts to produce, because the instinct when you are captured, when you are restrained, when you are placed in a cell, is to feel that the fight is over, to feel that you are helpless, to experience what psychologists call learned helplessness, the belief that your actions cannot affect your situation. That belief is the most dangerous thing that can happen to a captured soldier. It is more dangerous than the physical conditions. It is more dangerous than the restraints or the cell. Because the moment a soldier stops believing that their actions can make a difference, they stop attempting to escape. They stop resisting. They start cooperating. And cooperation, in the context of captivity by a hostile force, puts lives in danger. SARA training fights learned helplessness directly. It does this partly through the escape training itself, because learning to pick a lock, learning to defeat a restraint, learning to find the structural weakness in a cell, these are not just tactical skills. They are proof that action produces results. Every time a student successfully picks a lock in training, they internalize the message that they are not helpless. That message is more important than the specific skill. The specific skill might save their life. The message that their actions matter might save their mind. Now let us go deeper into the specific escape scenarios that SARA training uses, because the range of what soldiers train for extends well beyond the handcuff and the lock. The world is full of different types of captivity environments, and training has to account for as many of them as realistically possible. Vehicle escape is one significant training component. A captured soldier may be transported by vehicle, often in a trunk, a cargo area, or a modified transport container. SARA training teaches the techniques for escape from vehicle confinement, which present their own specific set of challenges. Modern vehicles have emergency trunk releases, which are now legally required in many countries. Soldiers learn these, but they also learn what to do when the release has been disabled or when the vehicle is something other than a standard commercial automobile. The technique for creating an opening in a modified or improvised vehicle transport involves assessing available tools, using the vehicle's motion and stops to create mechanical assistance for escape attempts, and timing the escape attempt for a moment when the vehicle's operation provides maximum cover. The sound of the engine masks the noise of movement. A turn creates a moment when the driver's attention is engaged. A stop at a checkpoint creates a window of external noise and activity that can be exploited. Water confinement is another training scenario, particularly for naval personnel and air crews. A pilot whose aircraft goes down over water may face not just the survival challenge of the water itself, but the additional risk of capture by a maritime force. The specific escape and evasion challenges associated with maritime captivity, being confined aboard a vessel, are addressed in the Navy's SARA program with particular attention. Escaping a ship at sea presents challenges that have no equivalent in land-based captivity. There are few places to go. The sea itself is a barrier. But even here, the trained soldier is looking for the weakness in the system, the moment when the watch changes, the sector of the vessel where attention is lowest, the radio protocol that suggests contact has been lost with a monitoring force, the indicators that a rescue might be close enough to make an escape attempt worthwhile. The concept of escape opportunity assessment deserves its own discussion, because one of the most important things SARA training teaches is not just how to escape, but when to attempt it. Because a failed escape attempt carries serious consequences. It typically results in increased restraint measures, reduced access to anything that could be used as an improvised tool, heightened guard attention, and in many real-world captivity scenarios, physical punishment. A failed escape attempt that reveals the escape capability to the captors can result in conditions that make any subsequent escape attempt virtually impossible. This is why the timing and conditions for an escape attempt are treated with as much seriousness in SARA training as the technical skills themselves. The general principle taught is that the best time to escape is as early as possible after capture. This is counterintuitive to many people. The instinct is often to wait, to observe, to learn the routines, to plan thoroughly before acting. And while observation and planning are important, the calculus strongly favors early action. In the early stages of captivity, the captor's control systems are least established. The restraints and confinement measures have been applied quickly and often imperfectly. The guards are focused on processing a new captive and may not have settled into the patterns of attention that they will develop over time. The captive's physical condition is at its best because the deteriorating effects of prolonged captivity, malnutrition, dehydration, sleep deprivation, and psychological erosion have not yet accumulated, and the distance from friendly forces is likely to be shortest immediately after capture, making evasion after escape more feasible. This is why the very first thing a trained soldier does upon capture is not to panic, not to resist visibly, but to begin assessing, immediately, even while being transported, even while hooded. The soldier is tracking time, feeling for turns, noting sounds, smelling the air for industrial or agricultural scents that suggest proximity to certain types of terrain, listening for language patterns that suggest distance from the point of capture, assessing the people who are handling them for professionalism, attention level, and organizational indicators. Every piece of information is a potential tool, and the trained mind is collecting tools from the first second of captivity. Now let us talk about what happens in the mind during this process. Because the physical skills of escape, impressive as they are, rest on a psychological foundation that is equally important and perhaps more difficult to develop. The mental discipline required to sit in a cell, in darkness, in discomfort, in fear, and to remain calm, to continue assessing, to continue believing that escape is possible and that your actions matter, that is not a natural human response. That is a trained response, and it is one of the most significant things that SERI produces. The psychological component of SERI training draws heavily from research into human behavior under extreme stress. The academic literature on captivity psychology is extensive. It draws on the documented experiences of American prisoners of war from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. It draws on the research of psychologists who interviewed returned prisoners over decades. It draws on controlled research into stress inoculation, the process by which controlled exposure to stressors builds psychological resilience in the same way that physical training builds muscle. And it draws on the accumulated wisdom of SERI instructors, who have watched thousands of soldiers and airmen and sailors go through the process and have learned to recognize the mental patterns that predict survival. One of the most important insights from this research is the concept of what psychologists call the locus of control. People with an internal locus of control believe that their actions determine their outcomes. People with an external locus of control believe that outcomes are determined by forces beyond their control. Under captivity conditions, an internal locus of control is a survival asset. It is what keeps a person attempting escape after a failed attempt. It is what keeps a person picking at a lock in the dark when they have been doing it for 3 hours with no progress. It is what keeps a person maintaining their mental discipline when every environmental signal is saying that resistance is futile. SERI training is, among other things, a systematic program for building internal locus of control in people who may already have it, but need to develop it under conditions of extreme stress. The training also addresses the social dynamics of captivity, because most soldiers who face captivity in a real operational scenario will not be captured alone. They may be part of a small group. And group dynamics under captivity stress are complicated. There is the temptation to look to a stronger or more vocal member of the group for leadership in a way that undermines the individual's own sense of agency. There is the risk of conflict and division under stress, which captors deliberately exploit. There are the psychological dynamics of watching fellow soldiers suffer, which can be as destabilizing as personal suffering. SERI training addresses all of these dynamics. It trains soldiers to maintain unit cohesion under captivity stress, to establish and maintain covert communication within a group of captives, to identify and support the psychologically vulnerable within the group without exposing that vulnerability to captors, and to coordinate collective escape efforts while maintaining the security necessary to prevent premature discovery. The covert communication piece of this is particularly fascinating because captors typically work hard to isolate prisoners from one another. They understand that communication builds resistance. They place captives in individual cells. They punish communication. They use the isolation itself as a psychological tool, and yet soldiers who have been properly trained find ways to communicate, tapping codes on shared walls, a version of Morse code or its own simplified military variant. Visual signals pass during the brief moments when captives are moved through shared spaces. Written messages on whatever materials are available, hidden in locations agreed upon during the earliest moments of captivity. The ingenuity that emerges from trained soldiers in captivity is remarkable, and the historical record confirms it. The tap code system used by American prisoners in North Vietnam, which allowed men in solitary confinement to maintain communication with each other through walls, is one of the most extraordinary examples of improvised human connection under conditions designed to destroy it. That system was not invented in the Hanoi Hilton. It was remembered from training. It was the application of pre-existing knowledge under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Let us talk now about the physical environment of the training facility itself in more detail. Because the cells used in Siri training are not random, they are specifically designed to represent realistic captivity environments while incorporating the deliberate vulnerabilities that make successful escape training possible. A SEER training cell typically has concrete or timber walls. The door is typically a standard commercial or institutional door with a commercial-grade lock. There may be a window, but it will be either too small to allow easy egress or positioned in a way that makes its use for escape a meaningful challenge. The lighting will be minimal, the temperature will be uncomfortable, but not dangerous. And somewhere in that cell, there will be one or more things that do not quite fit together perfectly. A hinge screw that has been slightly loosened, a gap between the door and the frame that is slightly larger than standard, a section of wall where the material is somewhat softer, a lock that is functional but not hardened. These are the deliberately designed weaknesses that allow trained students to succeed while still requiring genuine skill and effort to exploit. The instructors who design and maintain these facilities are themselves expert-level practitioners of the skills they teach. Many SEER instructors are former special operations personnel. Some have direct experience with actual captivity, either from operational deployments or from their own SEER training experiences. The best SEER instructors are not just skill transmitters, they are living proof of concept. When an instructor who has actually been through a real captivity situation or survived a real operational crisis tells a group of trainees that these skills work, that the training is real, that the principles hold under pressure, the impact of that testimony is qualitatively different from anything that could be delivered by someone without that experience. It lands differently, it goes deeper, it stays. Now let us look at some specific documented cases from history and from the training context where these techniques have proved their worth. Because the purpose of all of this training is not the training itself. The purpose is what happens when the training ends and the real world begins. And the real world has provided proof, repeatedly, that what SEER teaches saves lives and returns soldiers home. The most extensive real-world validation of escape and resistance training comes from the American prisoner of war experience in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese prisoner program was deliberate, sophisticated, and brutal. American airmen, primarily naval and Air Force pilots, shot down over North Vietnam, were subjected to captivity conditions that were designed to exploit every possible psychological vulnerability. They were tortured, they were isolated, they were subjected to propaganda programs designed to produce public statements condemning the war and legitimizing North Vietnamese military operations, and they were held for extraordinarily long periods. Some American POWs in Vietnam were held for more than 7 years. What the North Vietnamese did not fully account for was the degree to which the code of conduct and the training that supported it had prepared these men for exactly what they were facing. Men like Vice Admiral James Stockdale, who was the senior American officer held at the Hanoi Hilton and who spent over 7 years in captivity, including years in solitary confinement and subjected to repeated torture. Stockdale organized a comprehensive resistance program among the American prisoners that included covert communication systems, a chain of command maintained through walls and tapping codes, a set of principles for how to handle torture that balanced the requirement to resist with the recognition of human limits, and a collective identity built around resistance that preserved the psychological integrity of men who might otherwise have broken entirely. Stockdale was awarded the Medal of Honor for his leadership in captivity. He did not escape physically, but what he and his fellow prisoners maintained in the Hanoi Hilton, that organized, principled, collectively sustained resistance, was itself a form of victory. And it was built on the same foundation that SEER training seeks to lay. On the escape side of the ledger, the historical record is rich with examples of trained soldiers exploiting the kind of vulnerabilities that SEER teaches. The escape programs of World War II are the most extensively documented. The British MI9 organization, which was responsible for facilitating the escape and return of Allied airmen and soldiers from German captivity, developed a remarkable array of tools and techniques for supporting escape attempts. Escape kits were built into flight equipment. They contained miniature compasses hidden inside buttons, maps printed on silk that could be concealed in a jacket lining, tiny hacksaw blades sewn into belt buckles, concentrated food tablets, and currency for the countries over which missions were flown. The principle behind these tools was the same principle that underlies modern SEERAL training. Give the captured soldier the tools and the knowledge to take action, and they will. Human beings who have been prepared to escape will escape when given any viable opening. The escape rate among Allied airmen in World War II Europe was genuinely significant. Thousands of men who were shot down over occupied Europe successfully evaded capture or escaped captivity and made their way back to Allied territory through evasion lines maintained by resistance organizations. Many of these successful evaders credited not just the evasion networks that helped them, but the preparation they had received before their missions, the knowledge of local terrain, the evasion and concealment techniques, the behavioral principles for surviving in occupied territory. That preparation, like modern SEER training, was the difference between a man who panicked and was quickly captured and a man who had a plan and executed it. Let us also address something that people sometimes ask about this training. Is it really ethical to put military personnel through simulated captivity? To create conditions that include discomfort, sleep deprivation, psychological pressure, simulated interrogation, is that appropriate in a modern military that prides itself on the welfare of its people? The answer that the military gives, and that the history of captivity survival supports, is an unambiguous yes. It is appropriate because it is necessary. Because the alternative is sending people into a world where the risk of captivity is real, with no preparation for that reality. The controlled, monitored, carefully safety-managed stress of SEER training is not the enemy of soldier welfare. It is the protection of soldier welfare. It is the recognition that some things can only be learned by doing. You cannot teach someone to maintain psychological equilibrium under captivity stress by describing the experience. You have to approximate the experience. And approximating it, even partially, provides a kind of resilience that nothing else can build. There are rigorous protocols in place to ensure that SEER training remains on the right side of that line. Medical personnel are present throughout the captivity phase. There are strict physical safety limits that no instructor can override. There are detailed procedures for students who reach a genuine crisis point during the training. There is an immediate exit protocol that any student can invoke at any time, with the understanding that invoking it